I say good day, as I'm mindful that we are all in different time zones. Today, I will provide an update on Anguilla's ongoing work around several themes, including beneficial ownership, the implementation of beneficial ownership registers, the implementation of substantial activities requirement in Anguilla, as well as the overhaul of the company formation legislation, the Anguilla Business Companies Act, as well as other updates relating to Anguilla's work to implement certain tax good governance standards. Now, I want to emphasize the word ongoing. Some of this work has been implemented, but some continues to be ongoing and subject to change and continual improvements. All solutions have been under continuous review as we monitor and adapt in line with best practices and as we learn by doing. Now, the first theme to consider is the ongoing work around implementing a register of beneficial ownership information. In 2017, the Government of Anguilla made a commitment to the United Kingdom government to implement an electronically accessible repository of beneficial ownership information. This work entailed developing an electronic solution to store and provide access to beneficial ownership information, as well as implementing a legislative framework to enable same. Notwithstanding this commitment, increasingly we have witnessed calls for interconnected and publicly accessible registers of beneficial ownership to increase the transparency of corporate bodies. The EU and the UK are leading in this space. Now, we can all appreciate the importance of jurisdictions preventing the misuse of corporate structures for illicit activities, and Anguilla, as a responsible international financial center, must play a role in this global agenda. And admittedly, this is a complex agenda. As such, in 2020, Anguilla enhanced its 2016 commitment by further committing to move towards a publicly accessible register of beneficial ownership for companies in line with international standards and best practices as they develop, and in line with the principles of the EU 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive and its implementation by EU member states in a practical stepped approach by 2023. This is a three-staged approach. With the first stage, we will see the implementation of the private beneficial ownership register, which will be accessible to law enforcement agencies in furtherance of their duties and in accordance with valid agreements for the exchange of beneficial ownership information. Now, this beneficial ownership register system is actually part of a wider system, which is the company formation registration system. For this electronic system, we wanted a truly Anguillan solution that aligns our current regime. We did not want to have various overlapping regimes requiring population of information in multiple systems requiring duplicated efforts. As such, we focused on a new company registration system and information repository, which would allow for the formation of entities as well as compliance with certain information reporting requirements, including the beneficial ownership regime, as well as the substantial activity requirements. So this system has about three modules: the company registration portion, the portion relating to beneficial ownership information, as well as the portion relating to the economic substance requirements, the substantial activity requirements. This system is a complete replace of the now existing company registration system known as ACOR. So the first stage, in summary, is the implementation of a private beneficial ownership register alongside the larger company formation system, which will be accessible to law enforcement agencies in furtherance of their duties, and also our local competent authorities, the Financial Investigations Unit, as well as the Financial Services Commission, and of course, the registry staff who are responsible for the administration of the system. The second stage now is the expansion of the private register of BAO information, providing access still to law enforcement agencies, but also to persons with legitimate interests. Now, in terms of the construct of persons, being deemed as with legitimate interest. Now, jurisdictions vary in their construction of what constitutes that, but we envision in broad terms that this will be permitted to persons requiring access to such information for AML CFT purposes, such as banks and lawyers. Now, the regulations, so the legislative framework in Anguilla will define these persons and the terms under which they may be provided access to information. The staged approach, the legislative framework already incorporates the timelines envisioned under this three-stage approach. So the prescribed date at the moment for in the draft legislation for the implementation of the second stage, providing access for legitimate interest, is the 1st of January 2023. So it prescribes that this cannot be this access cannot be launched prior to the 1st of January 2023. Now, as I said before, this is ongoing work, so this is still draft legislation, which is subject to further approvals. In the third stage now, we will see the system still is, it's the wider registry system, so it's still a private register, but it will now be providing public access to certain specified beneficial ownership information. Obviously, the government is mindful that there's certain risks involved as it relates to BO information, and as such, full BO information would not be able to be provided to the general public. And the regulations specify which legislation, which information may be provided. Also, the legislation, the primary legislation, is also mindful that not all beneficial owners can be disclosed, and there's provisions within the legislation for where the beneficial owner is exposed to a risk of fraud or kidnapping or blackmail, or where they're able to demonstrate a risk, that they can apply to the registrar for non-disclosure of their information. So there's a lot of work being done in this space as it relates to the implementation of this BO register. The timelines are still quite generous because the public provision of information, BO information, is not scheduled to occur until the 1st of January 2024. So there's been continuous consultations, and these consultations will be ongoing. Now, in terms of a roadmap to the implementation of this public register of beneficial ownership information, in 2020, as I said before, in 2020, the government would have made a clear and strong commitment to the principles as set out by the EU's 5th Money Laundering Directive to move towards a publicly accessible register of beneficial ownership for companies in line with international standards and best practices as they developed. In terms of the legal framework, now we have to refine and enact the Commercial Registry and Beneficial Ownership Registration System Bill to require beneficial ownership information to be submitted to the electronic database. This will lean on the existing systems of requiring regulated service providers to collect, provide, and maintain this information. Now, the system which will allow for this registration and information repository, that has already, it's for the most part been developed, and now it's awaiting commissioning alongside the enactment of the legislation. The next process would be to populate the system with up-to-date, verified, and accurate beneficial ownership information via regulated service providers, and we will be working with the industry to develop a reasonable timeline for that population. So also planned is a review in 2022 of best practices in this space to consider the EU's, the implementation review of the EU directive, which is happening in 2022, and to incorporate any relevant findings from that review to further refine Anguilla's legal framework and system based on best practices. Now, the public access, as you can see there, is still scheduled for 2024, which is establishing public access to the beneficial ownership information held on the system in accordance with global norms and international standards. Now, in terms of the legal framework, the bill was released first for public consultation in September of this year, and we would have received comments in relation to that bill. Those comments have, for the most part, been incorporated. Now, some of these comments related to particularly the public register component of the system, such as the requirements to provide certain information related to persons who's accessing the information. So these comments have been incorporated, and a revised draft of the bill should shortly be released alongside the regulations for further comment. Now, this bill would repeal and replace the Company Registry Act. So it encapsulates those current provisions, as well as includes provisions relating to the BO register, which includes the duty to supply BO information, gateways to access for information, access by competent authorities, and applications for non-disclosure of registrable persons. The amended bill and associated regulations will shortly be released, as I mentioned. Now, the Anguilla Business Companies Act, the modernization of the company formation regime. The Anguilla Business Company legislation, the bill and the regulations, are part of an ongoing legislative reform towards the update of Anguilla's company regime. This reform will see the International Business Companies Act and the Companies Act repealed, and the company formation legislation will be modernized through the Business Companies Act. The legislation will provide for a flexible companies regime that increases the variety of types of legal structures that can be formed. The bill specifically facilitates the incorporation of companies which are permitted to conduct business both globally and domestically while complying with international standards. Now, the impetus for this reform stemmed from the need to modernize the companies legislation to both greater facilitate the formation of corporate structures, as no significance were made to these legislation for a while, except to meet international standards. So the intention was to create a piece of legislation that is fit for purpose, which adheres to international standards, but is also competitive. Several consultations were held in relation to the draft bill in 2020 through 2021, and revisions were made to the draft legislation in accordance with comments and contributions received under these consultations. Now, the Business Companies Act will serve as the core legal framework for regulating the incorporation and operation of several company types. These include companies limited by shares, companies limited by guarantees, not authorized to issue shares, unlimited companies, not authorized to issue shares, restricted purpose companies, segregated portfolio companies, private limited companies, PVTs. Those allow for a structure to be incorporated that is better suited to closely held operations such as family businesses and private trust companies, PTCs, which conduct only trust business, that is connected trust business. Companies can also be incorporated as restricted purpose companies, which are typically companies limited by share, which with clearly restricted objects or purposes, and companies also apply to be treated as exempted companies. Now, the ABC regulations. The ABC regulations are an integral part of the business companies legislation update to Anguilla's company regime. The ABC regulations address the treatment of companies' names, including foreign character names, the reuse of company names, and restrictions impacting company names. Clear provisions for the incorporation of registration of an Anguillan business company, segregated portfolio company, as well as other requirements for SPCs are also captured within the draft ABC regulations. The miscellaneous provisions also set out key provisions for voluntary liquidation. In addition, the draft ABC regulations outline fee structure and for filings which are mandated under the Business Companies Bill. Now, these fees, which are provided for under the regulations, were consulted on several times, and an extensive comparative review of fees of comparable jurisdictions was conducted. We focused on ensuring we have an attractive product at a competitive price. We feel confident that we have a well-framed product that will be well received by the market for the incorporation of a modern corporate structures on a modernized system. Now, the next area of work that I'll be giving an update on is in relation to international standards, particularly those of the exchange of information on request standard by the Global Forum, as well as the FHCP's application of the substantial activities requirements. So Anguilla periodically undergoes reviews from international bodies. Recently, Anguilla underwent an EOIR, Exchange of Information on Request review, by the Global Forum, at which it received a rating downgrade due in part to deficiencies relating to the availability of ownership and accounting information of Anguillan entities. Now, much work has been done in this space to improve the overall legal and regulatory framework. However, further work needs to be done to strengthen provisions relating to availability and access to accounting records. The overhaul of the companies regime, bringing in the Business Companies Bill, is a crucial part of this work. Now, in February 2021, amendments were made to the laws of Anguilla to strengthen the provisions relating to the availability of ownership and identity information, including mandating the provision of membership information on restoration and the maintenance of ownership of membership information for maintaining membership information for 6 years following dissolution. Now, the company regime is being overhauled with an intention to repeal the International Business Companies Act and the Companies Act via the new Anguilla Business Companies legislation. Now, this legislation improves the availability of ownership and identity information of Anguillan entities, as well as record-keeping requirements. It is against this backdrop of the work done so far that the Global Forum would have approved Anguilla's request for a supplementary review to review the work done so far in accordance with the international standards and reconsider Anguilla's rating. This review is currently awaiting further scheduling. As mentioned before, the amended business companies legislation will be implemented at the same time alongside the development of a bespoke company registration and information repository system. The system facilitating the maintenance of company information, including beneficial ownership information, which represents a shift in practice from this being maintained by third-party service providers to being centrally maintained by the government authorities. So this was progress in this area, which was well received. Now, in relation to the substantial activities requirements, in 2016, the EU adopted criteria covering tax transparency, fair taxation, and anti-base erosion and profit shifting, against which countries were assessed during a screening process conducted by the Code of Conduct Group during 2017. Anguilla was screened during this process, and the Code of Conduct Group identified concerns that there was an absence of legal substance requirements for entities doing business in or through Anguilla. Specifically, the rules needed to require Anguillans registered in Anguilla that are conducting certain relevant activities to demonstrate that they're conducting real economic activity and have a substantial presence in the jurisdiction. These rules were so implemented. The relevant activities within scope are banking, insurance, fund management, leasing, headquarters, shipping, intellectual property, distribution and service center business, and holding company business. An entity is an exempt entity if it is centrally managed and controlled or carries on a relevant activity in a jurisdiction at which the company may be charged tax is 10% or higher, and the company is resident for tax purposes in that jurisdiction. Now, the economic substance requirements were applied to new companies from incorporation in January 2019, and existing companies as at 31st December 2018 from the 1st of July 2019. This framework right now remains largely unchanged and will be transposed within the new Business Companies Act. Now, minor amendments were made to bring the legislative framework in line with the standard, including allowing for the expanded exchange of information with jurisdictions for which there are valid exchange agreements beyond the EU member states. Now, further, in 2019, EU member states agreed to explore the extent to which entities with the legal form of partnerships in the various 2.2 jurisdictions were relevant and in scope of the domestic substance requirements. Concerning Anguilla, it was concluded that the domestic economic substance legislation did not cover all the appropriate categories of partnerships. The economic substantial activity requirements are currently applied to limited partnerships, but they were not applicable to the general partnerships, which is the Partnerships Act. So there was a request of Anguilla to include general partnerships in the scope of economic substance requirements by 30th of June 2021. In June 2021, Anguilla would have amended the Trade, Businesses, Occupations, Professions Licensing Act to address member states' concerns that general partnerships should be within scope of the economic substance requirements. Particularly, the business licensing framework was amended to prohibit the issuance of business licenses in Anguilla to unregistered or unincorporated partnerships in conducting specified relevant activities. This provision will require persons to be registered company or limited partnership to be issued a license to conduct relevant activities. Now, this amendment met the EU's requirement. Subsequently, however, the legislation will be repealed in January of next year. It's going to be a complete overhaul of the business licensing framework, which was significantly overdue. However, a copy of the bill has been supplied to the EU for their review, and they have confirmed it's in accordance with their requirements. So we're expecting a new licensing framework within the new year, but it still keeps the provisions related to the relevant activities. So there is a lot of ongoing legislative reform as it relates to the business licensing framework, as well as the company's formation framework. And we're trying to keep consistent between these two pieces of legislation, our substantial activities frameworks. And we also, as I mentioned before, we have the Commercial Registry of Beneficial Ownership Registration System Bill, which will govern the Beneficial Ownership Information Register. Now, lastly, in relation to the substantial activities, the FATP, the Forum on Harmful Tax Practices, has decided to resume the application of the substantial activities requirement for no or nominal tax jurisdictions. This global standard means that mobile business income cannot be parked in a jurisdiction where without the core business function having been undertaken by the same business entity or in the same location. Now, these this substantial activities requirement regime will be subject to monitoring by the FHTP. The first monitoring of the enforcement and compliance activity was conducted this year in November, and the next review is scheduled to be conducted in April of next year. So between now and then, Anguilla will be increasing its monitoring activities. We will have the company registration system come on stream, which will be able to facilitate the filing of returns in respect of this regime. And then Anguilla will be pursuing with its monitoring and enforcement regimes. So that is all for my update in relation to these ongoing works. Any questions? Thank you.